So what is a paint inlay? Paint inlays came from a vision that Josie and I had when we felt there was something missing from the market. There was space for something maybe a little more organic, artisanal, made from actual paint that bonds to your surface. So paint inlays are made from a proprietary paint that is much similar to a gouache. When it is applied, it is water reactive until sealed.
What that means is you can move that pigment around, doing all kinds of cool things, putting your own unique spin on it, special techniques until you seal it. It's movable. Today, we're going to go into the basics of using and the two main ways, and those would be using a traditional chalk or mineral type paint or using a flat, clear top coat. Both have their unique attributes, and today we're going to teach you why you might choose one or the other. Let's get into using your inlays with chalk or mineral type paint. The two cool attributes of using inlays with chalk type paint is that you can actually have an unlimited open time. So once you've applied it to your surface and you walk away to do something else, you can come back to it a week later. So it's very forgiving in that regard before you remove the carrier sheets. The other cool thing about it is that you're going to be able to get multiple uses out of those inlay sheets. So that's something to consider when you're using it with chalk paint.
One of the challenges with using chalk type paint is that the textural difference, when you lay the inlay onto the wet chalk paint, it will smooth that area out. So if you're not using the inlay over the entire piece, you'll have textural differences. So
that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Let's show them how to do it. As always, you want to start with having your piece appropriately prepped for painting. Then you're going to base coat it in the same color that you're going to be applying your inlay with. In this case, we have a nice dark blue. We want to make sure that this base coat is thoroughly dry before we start our inlay process. To get started with the inlay, we are going to trim it. The inlays are 12 by 16 sheets, and each of them has about a 1/4 inch margin on them that you'll want to trim off. You can also use a large paper trimmer if you have one, but it's not difficult to get in there with scissors. Then you're going to arrange them in an area nearby in the same arrangement that you're going to apply them in, so that visually you can see how you want them arranged on your piece. After you've done that, you're going to set them on a non-porous surface. We're using one of our thin mounts. And the reason for that is we're just going to mist it. And the reason we pre-mist it just with water while we're preparing to apply them is that pre-expands those fibers and it minimizes the wrinkling once you lay them into your wet medium. Just give them a nice light mist. They don't need to be sopping wet, but you can see how they immediately start getting a little bit of wrinkle to them. You're essentially just being preemptive. Now we're going to apply a medium coat, and we're going to work in 12 by 16 sections so that the paint goes on just thick enough so that it does not dry before we get our inlay set into it. You can use a paintbrush, or you can use a silicone paint blade. In this case, I'm going to use a silicone paint blade because I want to have as smooth with few brush strokes so that the areas that do not have the inlay on them are still smooth. It's worth noting though, it works great with the brush too. Now we're going to lay the inlay into it. Working on a vertical surface gives you a little bit of an advantage because you have gravity working with you. but you do have a little bit of open time to fudge it around a bit as needed. There we go. Just gonna get that in there. And then we're going to use the brayer, and we're going to, from the center out, roll and smooth it with light pressure. You don't need much pressure. And the thing that is cool about the brayer is it minimizes greatly any bubbles, which can result in little voids. Whenever you're giving instruction on how to do something, you get, technical, you kind of get in the weeds of it, but it can also kind of make it sound more difficult than it is. It's really pretty forgiving. And I'm getting right up to that edge with the paint and not going over it too as much as possible. One thing you always want to do is make sure that you are applying the paint side to the paint. You'll see there's a grid printed on the paper, and the other side is your paint. You want paint to paint. And now we're going to check our design and line it up to it. And we're kind of prioritizing this edge where we want it to match up. And then gonna quickly, you have a little open time, a little forgiveness there. And sometimes you kind of smudge it a little bit or kind of move it a little bit, and there's a nice stretch to our carrier paper, as you can see. In fact, this part here, I'm going to dampen a little bit more. And whenever you need to do that, you want to be mindful, if you've already exposed a spot, not to get it too wet. And I'm going to go back in and get a little more paint out there. There we go. There we go. That's better. And now, again, we're going to move from the middle out. We're going to smooth it out towards the edge. You want to remember that part of the reason and what makes inlays so special is the fact that they are not a manufactured in that same sense as a transfer. It's organic, it's a working medium, and it's the inherent differences and the inherent texture and the little bits of distress that make it special. So you don't want to get too worried about, an imperfectly aligned seam or a wrinkle here or there. Those are the things that make this process beautiful and usually end up being the thing that you love most about it. So now that these are applied, like we mentioned earlier, this is an unlimited open time. You can set this aside and come back to it a week later, though most people cannot wait that long, and you'll be fine to remove it. So we're gonna set that aside and let it dry and come back to show you how to remove it. There we go. So the way we remove these is we are going to dampen them. You can use a damp cloth. I have a mister here. I'll just go ahead and get it wet here. And again, if you are working up against an edge that you had already applied some of the inlay to, you're not going to want to get that too wet and cause the pigment to run. You just got to be mindful of the water reactivatable nature of the paint. There we go. So this is nice and damp. Sometimes you might let it set a couple seconds. I don't think we really need to here. Let's go ahead and start peeling this off. Nice, this is coming off great. If there's too much tension, it should never rip, or not like a big piece of rip. A little corner might rip here or there, but it should not have so much tension on it that it's tearing when you're removing it. If it is, then you need to go back in, add a little more moisture, and wait and try again. There we go. Now let's get this corner. Little pro tip, when you are preparing your inlays, if you fold a corner upwards after you lay it down where there isn't any design, it can give you a little spot to grab it. You can see here, because we brayered, and we brayered from the inside out, it's a very smooth finish, and there's very little in the way of bubbles or wrinkles. Now that's something that is going to vary by your own individual taste, and you can either amplify one way or other, but you can see this beautiful finish. You can see you have a very nice total overall finish. We'll go in close a little bit here so we can demonstrate what we mean by textural difference. You can see here where the inlay has been placed is very smooth because the paper's been on there, we've brayered it, whereas at the edge up to it, you can still see brush strokes from the base coat. So that's something, one of the attributes of chalk type paint and mineral type paint, because it's so rich and thick, that is going to be more noticeable. Now, if you know you want to use chalk type paint on the project, say you're covering the full surface and you're going sheet to sheet, so there's not going to be a lot of exposed area, and you're planning for that, another way to minimize textural differences is to dilute your chalk paint for the inlay process to about the texture of heavy cream, because it's actually that inherent thickness that creates that beautiful texture we love that makes it challenging to match the two when you're doing an inlay. So those are the steps for applying, and you're going to repeat that process. And actually, like we said, because you have that open time, you can actually go in and you can sheet to sheet, do one sheet after the other laying into your paint, and you don't have to remove any until they are all applied because of that open time. And that simply means the time that you can wait in between application and removal. So you could go in and you could do all your application, and then an hour later, or however long, do all your removal. Now, a note on different types of furniture paint, we're talking about a true mineral or chalk type paint that has very little in the way of polymer binders. If you're using a paint that has built-in top coats or things of that nature, those polymer binders, the timing is different. You essentially can do the same application, but you need to be more mindful of your timing for removal. And that's something we're going to actually address when we go into section 2 for top coat application as well. So once you've got those all applied and you have it like you want, if you want to go in and move some pigment around or get special effects from that reactive nature, now's the time to do that. Because until you've applied your sealers, it's reactive, it's movement, it's a live project. So this looks great like it is, and I'm going to go for a smooth kind of, not super distressed look. And I'm going to let this dry thoroughly, and then I'm going to apply the sealer. So we talked about getting multiple reuses out of your inlay sheets. So when you remove them from your project, like you saw a little while ago, you're going to set them aside on a flat, clean area to dry, and you're going to save those. So here's the cool thing. Let's take a little closer look at this, and you'll see there's still pigment in there, okay? But you've also picked up pigment from the surface and the paint that you laid it into, in this case, a nice deep blue. When you go to use this again, you will transfer little bits of that. And it's really cool. It actually, you get a look that you probably could not get if you planned and tried to get it, because it's just so, it's bringing in a facet that isn't completely controllable. And that's a good thing in our opinion. So say you went on to a white project on your second one, you would get some of that blue color play in there. If you went onto a dark project, it wouldn't be as noticeable. However, because you're starting with less pigment in your inlay design, that's going to show less on a darker color. But it does show, and it does look really cool. You can find projects and videos on reuses that go into that. So you're just going to set those aside so they dry well, and you're going to save them for another project. Once you are ready to seal, you're going to get your favorite flat polyurethane top coat. There's all kinds of brands, and you're going to want to test them, but we're using General Finishes Flat Out Flat because we found it works well. But talk to your stockist about some of their favorite flat finishes because they're going to have all kinds of knowledge to share. What we have found is in the past, we've actually recommended only spraying on your first coat because brushing creates friction and pulls pigment and smudges it. However, we've since found through our testing that as long as you have a really good working sponge roller that is not old or that doesn't drag, it spins freely, you can roll your top coat onto your piece without smearing your inlay design. Let's go ahead and get started. That said, you can also use a spray-on sealer for your first coat and then do your other coats, your subsequent coats with a brush. As long as you don't overwork it, you're fine. When you first go on with a sponge roller, and those of you who use sponge rollers know that you'll get a little bit of surface bubbling. As it dries, those settle down. One more pass here. And we're going to set this aside and let it dry so that we can then show you the finished result. I know that also a lot of people like using a wax finish, and there's some wonderful wax finishes out there. Some of them work great with inlays, but all the formulas do vary by brand and manufacturer, so you always want to test a spot because some do a thorough job of sealing and some they don't seal the same way that a liquid top coat does. So you want to test it out depending on what you're using. Another option, because we know that waxes give you that velvety finish that we love, another option is to go on initially with your liquid top coat, and when that is thoroughly dried and actually preferably cured, you can go in and buff a nice velvety wax top coat into it.
Let's talk about using a matte polyurethane top coat. Some of the attributes of using that type of a finish are that you can go in with all of your specialty finishes and perfect them, get them exactly how you want them, and then come in with the top coat, which the inlay lays into. Also, it minimizes the textural differences between where you painted and where you put in the inlay.
It really does. It makes it basically where there aren't any. Mm-hmm. However, there's inherent challenges with using a top coat for your inlay medium. One is you have a way shorter open time. From the time you place it into your wet top coat to the time you remove it is about a 5 to 10 minute window. The other aspect of it is you're going to get fewer reuses, if any, because those polymer top coats tend to really grab that pigment off the sheet. The third challenge of it is that if you want to take advantage of being able to move that pigment around and that water reactivity, that can sometimes be minimized by using the top coat technique because again, it wants to grab those binders. So you do get some movement still. It's not sealed until you seal it. However, it is something to keep in mind. As always, you want to make sure that your piece has been properly prepared, cleaned, and so forth. And do your finish however you would like it. get it perfected because your inlay application will not interfere or change that significantly. In this case, we did a broken color technique with in neutral colors using our troweling to get kind of a plastery, our silicone blade rather, to get kind of a plastery look that we love, as you can see. So we're going to start by preparing those inlays just like we do with when you're using paint, chalk paint to apply your inlays. Much of the preparation is the same. So you get those all trimmed out and you get them arranged exactly how you want to have them on your piece so that you've got a visual of how you're going to apply them. And then, of course, you are going to prepare them with your pre-misting. Remember, we talked about why we mist these ahead of time and set them aside as we're preparing to apply them, because that pre-expands the fibers in the carrier sheets so that it does not expand when it hits the medium that you're applying it into. So it gives you a smoother, less wrinkles in your finish. Now, just like I said before, sometimes you want more wrinkles and you want the texture that those wrinkles bring. It kind of creates in fact, you could do a really cool kind of faux leather look with that if you wanted to maximize that. But in this case, and probably in most cases, you're minimizing that. So we're gonna set those aside. Okay, now remember, if this is your first time on your first project doing this, you're going to want to work one sheet at a time because you've got that 5 to 10 minute window once you've applied your inlay before you're going to want to start checking for removal. So let's actually do it that way. We're going to work in a 12 by 16 section, a little bit bigger, so you're covering, making sure you've got enough space to have ample coverage for your inlay. And we're going to hit half of this essentially. A little more, because a little overlap is okay. I'm gonna go a little bit more. Not terribly heavy, but just making sure you've got a good coat and you are getting your inlay on there before it has had an opportunity to dry. Now we're going to lay our inlay in place. There we go. And actually I'm going to little taut. You'll notice that when your inlay is damp, it's got some give and some stretch to it. And you also have a little bit of a window to do a little rearranging before it starts transferring onto the surface. And you can do a little fudging there. Then we're going to take our brayer from the middle working outwards. And like I said before, you are eliminating bubbles and voids with your brayer. And that's why the brayer is really helpful. Now, if you're on a surface that doesn't work for a brayer because it's either too small, your inlays pieces are too small, or it's a very complex curved surface, you can use something else like a folded damper cloth, or a foam brush also works. Okay, now we're going to apply the other half. We're avoiding getting too juicy or sloppy, especially near your seams. And we're going to prioritize the placement of lining the designs up. And you always want to line up to the design There we go. Oops. As opposed to worrying about the grid. The grid is helpful, definitely, but you first look to make sure that your design is properly lined up. Okay, we're gonna just fudge that in there. Remember, always, always, always grid side up, paint side down. It's not difficult to get that backwards, so just pay attention to that. And we really have a nice, see how you have stretch there? It really gives you some stretch, which is nice. Okay, we're gonna check our seams. I'm gonna fudge it right up to each other there. That should give us a really nice seam. In fact, okay, see there's a tiny gap there. We're gonna just, when we have this little window of opportunity, we're gonna get in there and get that nice and close. Okay, now from the middle out, we are going to, including your seam, and getting that brayer on the seam will help ensure you don't have any gathered or petaled finish right there. The brayer, or in the case of if you're using a damp sponge, the purpose is making really good surface contact. Okay, now we're going to time this for 5 minutes. When you're at home doing this, if you're working a sheet at a time, it's going to be more accurate. But this is a 5 to 10 minute window. Let's go ahead and let this dry, or I'm sorry, set for 5 minutes, and then remove it. Okay, this has had a good 5 minutes, and we're going to check a corner and see if it is indeed the paint has transferred. Now, you don't, depending on how damp it is, you don't always have to get the paper wet to remove when you are doing this because it's a shorter time. Okay, yes, we've got a good transfer here, and we're gonna go ahead and remove it. If that is not the case, you're going to put it back down, dampen it, and smooth it out, and check again in a couple of minutes. But since it is, we'll go ahead and remove it. I'm gonna go ahead and give it a mist, which helps to release the paper from the surface. And now we're going to remove these and then set them aside in a flat spot, because we talk about getting multiple uses. And that's a little different when you're using the top coat. You don't get as many. However, it's possible to get just a tiny bit more of the pigment out of it when you're doing the top coat method. Because remember, top coats, their job is to bind. And so they really grab that pigment and bind it. I must say, this is almost too perfect. We don't have very much chippy or anything like that, because we want to, of course, remember our expectations, and the beauty of this product is these little chips and the organic characteristics of the way they take. But this is beautiful. Okay, so we're gonna let this dry thoroughly, because before you ever go on with your top coat, you wanna make sure it's good and dry. So we're gonna let this dry thoroughly, and then we're going to put our initial top coat of a rolled on flat top coat. Now, you don't have to use a flat top coat for your first coat, but that's what we're using today. You do want to use a flat top coat for the inlay process when you're doing the top coat application for your inlays. So let's let this dry for a minute or two and come back and seal this bad boy. Okay, this is dry, has a nice velvety surface, and we're going to apply our initial top coat. We're going to roll it on, because remember, a brush creates friction and can drag and blur pigment. So as long as your roller is smooth rolling, in good working order, and is not tugging or dragging, it should not blur your piece. And as long as you're not overworking it. Here we go. After your initial setting coat has dried, you can go on with subsequent brushed on, because then you're not going to be pulling pigment or blurring it. As an alternative to rolling on a sealer, you can also, for your initial setting coat, use a sprayed on sealer, just like we talked about earlier with the chalk paint application. So those are the ins and outs of the two main ways of using your inlays: applying them with chalk type paint like we talked about earlier, and applying them with a clear top coat. Let's let this dry and then give you a peek at how beautifully smooth it comes out.